Professor Laird here. This is the video lecture for Chapter 1, the Introduction to the Political Ideologies class. This is the textbook that the material is coming from, for the most part. So let's get into it. First thing I want to talk about the concept of ideologies in general before we get into some definitions. Ideologies typically have their origins in the ideas of earlier thinkers or some earlier thinker. John Maynard Keynes, who was himself an economist, talking here that practical men who believe themselves to be quite exempt from any intellectual influences are usually the slaves of some defunct economist. Also, we want to understand ideologies better, just so that we're more knowledgeable about history. Ignorance of the past will keep us from understanding ourselves and the world in which we live. And what we'll see in this class fairly soon, this first section for the most part, we'll talk about how the 20th century resulted in somewhat of a clash between these ideologies of liberalism, communism, fascism for the most important ones. So, what is the political ideology? Ideologies are inherently political because they're dealing with human beings trying to resolve differences. Politics is the art of resolving differences, them typically being ideological differences. Just giving an example here. Let's just say you live in a town that is needing a new school. So a proposal for the new school, that's in itself not a controversial thing. But as you start planning for this school, you may ask yourself, is it a taxpayer-supported public school or will it be a tuition-supported private school? Those are two very different things that are driven by people's beliefs and their ideas of what they think might be better or worse. Would we, in this school, would we teach natural selection or would we teach intelligent design? Intelligent design being the substitute for creationism, and most courts have pretty much banned the teaching of intelligent design in public schools because of that separation of church and state. But if you do have a private school, then that would be a choice that you could potentially make to teach in that school. Would you teach sex education in that school, for example? Would prayer be allowed in that school? So those are some things that we have to deal with on a regular basis, particularly with politics and decision making, as far as the ideologies that people have that they bring to the table. Now, as far as the working definition of ideology, the book has a pretty comprehensive definition here as far as what makes it an ideology. An ideology is a fairly coherent and comprehensive set of ideas that most importantly explains and evaluates social conditions, also helps people understand their place in society, and provides a program for social and political action. So an ideology, per their definition, is something that covers those four main points, whereas we'll see in other types of beliefs or isms that we'll get into here in a minute, they may not cover those things. Now, an ideologue is someone who tries to persuade others to accept this ideology that they believe in. Ideologies and the ideologues that support them, they are often framing these in terms of good versus bad, right versus wrong, because that's what appeals to us as humans. We're going to be talking about this quite a bit throughout the class as far as what generally drives human beings. And we are generally driven by our emotions, our beliefs, our perceptions, our opinions, things like that. So this is what we call normative. coming from the word norms, which I'll go ahead and introduce that as well. Norms are the standard rules of behavior in a society that everyone tends to agree as to how we should live or how we ought to live. So therefore, something that is normative, such as ideologies and beliefs and our opinions, are typically normative because they are expressing how we feel that people should live or what we ought to do. And this is what makes it so much different from the scientific analysis that I'll be stressing so much in this class, in that in order to objectively analyze an issue, we would have to step back from it and avoid those normative views that we want to tell what we think about something of how it ought to be or how things should be. So the ideology is not a scientific theory, which is empirical based on analysis of the facts. Empirical theories are used to describe something rather than prescribe something, which is what the ultimate goal of the ideology is to prescribe a course of action that will make things like the way we want it to be. Now, as far as the isms, and we'll, before this chapter's over, we'll compare several isms out there. Ideology is not necessarily the same as these isms. Ideologues will use their ideologies to develop a strategy for promoting an agenda and advancing their causes. But things such as terrorism, nationalism, populism, anarchism, we'll touch on some of these here in a minute. They may provide a program of action, but they do not necessarily explain or evaluate conditions, because that might just get in the way of what people feel like what we ought to do or what we should do. If it's based on our beliefs, our opinions, our perceptions, our emotions, then we don't necessarily need to explain or evaluate. We just need to inspire action. So that's somewhat of the difference there. As far as philosophy goes, there is a difference between a political philosophy and an ideology. It's a matter of a degree. Philosophy, by definition, is a rational investigation of the truth or of human principles of how we behave, trying to understand that, the why, the what for. Ideology generally is simpler, less abstract, and, as I've said before, generally normative in order to fix focus on the action itself rather than understanding how the world works or why human beings do the things we do. And so one of the objectives of this course, therefore, is to try to understand how the world works and why people do the things they do through these ideologies. How do we come up with these ideologies and why? And what have they inspired? What are some of the problems that have come about? What are some of the benefits that have come about through these various ideologies that we'll be talking about? Looking at democracy, for example, most ideologies claim to be democratic in some form. Even if it's a dictator, that dictator may feel like that he's got everyone's best interests at heart there. But their democracy is, the way it's being used, somewhat vague and loose in order to serve a function. And as we'll get into fairly quickly in one of the earlier chapters, we'll talk quite a bit about this democratic ideal. It's more of an ideal to aspire to rather than an ideology. Looking at religions, we see throughout history that religions have often inspired ideologies. Religions have also inspired very important institutions that we have in our world today. But Religions are more concerned with the supernatural and divine, of trying to motivate people to behave in a certain way that, of course, has benefits to be more peaceful and orderly in society, for example, and get the rewards later on in the afterlife. So therefore, it's more concerned with achieving that more so than the here and now. As we'll see later on, one of Karl Marx's objections with trying to get the workers of his region to come together, that religion was distracting or deflecting people from focusing on activism now, and rather than waiting for the rewards in the afterlife. So that's something we'll talk about in more detail later. And as you'll see, as we go through the class, a lot of the things that we're talking about today in this introductory chapter, we'll get into more detail later. This is why this is the introduction. We're touching on some basic things here that we will most likely get into more detail later on. Now, as far as the concept of human nature, there's some general competing conceptions of human nature that these various ideologies have kind of latched onto as far as what has driven them. So humans, in one of these conceptions, is that humans are naturally competitive and acquisitive. That's not inquisitive, that's acquisitive, as far as wanting to obtain things and to acquire things, self-interested. Now, despite the fact that that might sound a little self-interested, well, that's kind of what our Western democratic systems have been based on, this more of an individualistic drive, this competitiveness and pursuit of self-interests, which is what capitalism has thrived on. So the concepts of our classical liberalism that we'll be getting into earlier on and the contemporary libertarianism, those are some ideologies that embrace this type of conception of human nature. Another competing conception is that humans are naturally cooperative and generous. And of course, we would like to think is kind of a positive frame of mind that we are like that. However, the ideologies that have been basing themselves on that fundamental concept of human nature have not been quite as successful. Particularly, communism has failed miserably, and we'll get into why that is. Now, socialism does have some aspects that have maintained themselves over the centuries, and we're actually seeing a little bit of hybrid mixing between capitalist systems and socialist systems that are trying to look at the best of both worlds, things like that. But the concept that humans are just naturally cooperative and generous and altruistic has not really held up as well as the concepts that are such as capitalism and liberalism, which are kind of using, and we'll get into this a lot more detail as well, is that the concepts that have been the most successful are recognizing the idea that humans are generally competitive, generally self-interested, but yet we're trying to create a system with institutions that are trying to channel that self-interest into a public good. And those have been relatively successful. Another concept of human nature that has had considerably more problems attached with it is that humans have innate differences such as racial differences, ethnic differences, and that it is somewhat unnatural to try to seek harmony between these different groups of humans, but rather to pursue dominance and control over groups. And this is where fascism and Nazism had their roots. So, and of course, they were quite destructive and have been weeded out for the most part and really the democratic systems of the world have really kind of been on guard of trying to prevent these types of systems from flaring up. Let's look at the concept of freedom or liberty, which we all perhaps take for granted to a certain degree in a country like the United States. Around the world, it is somewhat of a contested concept because every ideology out there claims to promote some form of freedom, and this could actually be freedom from having a government that's trying to keep things organized or provide public goods. But we'll get into the Bill of Rights and the Constitution here fairly early on, but there's two basic types of freedoms, and this is the freedom to do something that you would like to do, and these are what we call the rights and the liberties, such as the right of free speech, things like that. And then the other types of freedoms are to be free from something that's imposed upon you. These are the protections and the guarantees, such as the right of habeas corpus, which means you have the guarantee that you're not going to be thrown in the dungeon and never seen again when you get arrested. Now, some examples is that you have in our Constitution, the very First Amendment, the first thing mentioned is you're free to worship your own religion, but at the same side of that, we are free from having the government establish a national religion, so that it goes both ways. The concept of freedom typically involves some agent, some citizen, some person out there in the world that has a goal that they feel like that they may not be achieving that goal, and there's some barrier, obstacle blocking the agent from that goal. So that's just where they have their origins. Let's talk about the concept of revolution, where to some, the gradual forces of change or the pushes for reform may not be enough, and they may need to take it to the next level. The aim there is to overthrow the old order, and that's whether it could be corrupt or entrenched in its power or retarding progress for more creative individuals. Looking at some examples, Roman Catholic Church have inspired protest, which led to the first of all, to the Reformation that we'll be talking about, and then the Enlightenment beyond that. Feudalism resulted in quite a bit of protests that opened the door for early capitalist systems. We'll even touch on that a little bit, formation of the state. The concept of liberalism sought to free individuals to make the most of themselves. And then during the Enlightenment, which was also called the Age of Reason, which pushed back against the Dark Ages, the religiously ruled orders of doctrine and dogma, to where trying to overcome the dictation of beliefs and superstitions, and therefore using scientific inquiry and reason, and that the world could perhaps be perfected by human action. Again, perfected in quotes there. Never would really reach perfection, of course, but always looking for something better. And revolution does not necessarily mean war. A lot of war did break out during these periods, of course, and war could still potentially break out even in today's world, but some revolutions do occur without necessarily having conflict and war. Concept of nationalism, this is the idea that nationality and citizenship should not be separated. And nationality, in this case, we would tie that with some common concept that humans identify with. identity groups. We'll get into that here in just a second. Napoleon's conquests in Europe, and this was the pursuit of the Napoleon nation state there, inspired backlashes of Germany, Italy, and others to recognize their own nation states. So the concept of the modern state had already been forming, but Napoleon's conquest kind of locked that in to creating the idea of your own nation state. Not quite a perfect model, obviously, because many states, including the United States, Canada, the UK, have many different nationalities, so to speak, within their borders. And the concept of nation state, or the pursuit of a nation state, has resulted in quite a bit of conflict. The Soviet Union split up at the end of the Cold War. Yugoslavia, another example in the early 90s that split along ethnic national lines. Looking at the maps here, prior to the end of the Cold War, Yugoslavia was a one country there, about the size of Texas when you put it all together. But after the fall of the Soviet Union, it is broken up into 7 and still counting, because Bosnia and Herzegovina could potentially split up yet again still into 2 more countries. And these are all divided along ethnic identity group lines here. So that has resulted in quite a bit of conflict. The nation state, a self-governing unit that binds feelings and needs of people, ideally a culturally homogeneous population, which is really kind of hard to achieve. Unfortunately, there does not exist, nor has never existed, a nation state in the perfect sense. And currently, as I said, ethnic division is the biggest source of the conflict in the world right at the moment. There is more conflict within states than there is between states around the world. Another ism that we'll touch on a little bit more as we go, populism. This is something that kind of appeals to people at a particular time, that people are waiting to be told something of what they want at that particular moment, and then that certain person, a demagogue, could come along and inspire those people. Demagogue or demagoguery, that's appealing to people's emotions, appealing to their passions, to their prejudices, perhaps even to some lowest common denominators, in order to inspire people to rally around them, and that could put them into power. Tribal thinking, opposed to elitism or established institutions that have perceived that are not working for them. That's another definition of how populism works, where people are dissatisfied with things such as the free press, such as the courts, not satisfied with the current rule of law, may not be acceptable to rights of minorities, or to encroaching multiculturalism. Those are some things that can appeal to people who are driven by their passions, by their emotions, by their prejudices, and then somebody can come along and capitalize on that. An opportunist is a good example of someone that might do that and then rally those people into a base group that could support them. And anarchism, it does not necessarily mean chaos, but anarchism in this sense means that there's no government, and that although anarchism has really kind of gone out of favor for a long time, once we realized how successful, relatively speaking, how successful the United States democratic government has been, that to overthrow it has been considered counterproductive for quite a while. And the fact of the matter is that all governments, no matter how democratic they are, force people to do what they don't want to do in order to alleviate social costs, or to provide some common good for the greatest number of people. And the anarchist does not believe that government is necessarily unnecessary, but that it is wrong or evil, or that it should be abolished in favor of voluntary cooperation. And then that gets into this idea that human beings are going to be naturally cooperative and easy to get along with. Well, that's obviously arguable. That government exists for some very important reasons, been around for a long time, and human societies have been enormously successful as a result of that, and not the other way around. Now, the disagreements and differences between anarchists tend to overwhelm the single point upon which they agree, which is what we don't want government, but then there's all kinds of oppositions that pop up beyond that. So finally, let's look at just a quick intro into the United States political divide, and that's between the conservative side of politics. We have a two-party system. We'll touch on that a little bit more. The Republican Party is on the conservative side of politics. They are general. Again, these are general things because in the last administration, there's been lots of things that have been going on that may not have been traditionally Republican as far as what we've seen in the past. But they're looking at traditional values, family values, free market principles, trying to get less government intervention, government more out of the way to let people and let the markets solve problems for the most part, like I said, in general. But even a conservative person will want government involved in things that they believe in. The liberal side of politics, the Democratic Party, is a little bit more, in general, accepting of shifting norms, of things changing, a little bit more amenable to change in order to make improvements. And then, of course, a little bit more, I guess you could say, pro-equality of humans, whereas you could say the conservative side is a little bit more pro-equal opportunity. Here we might be a little bit more pro-equality of humans overall in general. And this, of course, require a more proactive government to pursue these types of things. So that's the general difference between the U.S. political ideologies that we'll touch on more as we go. Okay, so that was the video lecture for Chapter 1, Introduction to the Course. As we do for almost every video lecture, there'll be a discussion forum posted on the same day. You'll respond to the discussion forum by the deadline.